We've all been there. You just told your patient that their cholesterol is elevated, and their immediate next question is, okay, so what should I eat? And your brain starts flipping through every diet you've ever heard of. Mediterranean, DASH, low fat. But this patient wants to try the carnivore diet. And now you're wondering, is this even safe? What should I recommend? So if you've ever wished for a straight talking expert to help you make sense of it all, you're going to love this episode. I'm Colleen, a PA, dietitian, and your nutrition mentor. Welcome to the Exam Room Nutrition Podcast, your guide to giving better nutrition advice. Today, I am thrilled to welcome back Dr. Josh Wageman. Now, if you missed our last episode together, Josh is a clinical lipid specialist with multiple doctoral degrees and a knack for explaining complex concepts with analogies you'll never forget. He's also the author of The Home Security System and The Lipid Neighborhood, a book that makes cholesterol and heart disease prevention surprisingly fun to learn. In our conversation today, we're diving into the diet side of the lipid story. We're going to be talking about why Josh doesn't believe in a single, quote, best diet, but he does have a few non-negotiables. You'll learn how to support patients who want to try the keto or carnivore diet, and what to do if their LDL levels go sky high. And you'll learn a simple mantra Josh uses with every patient: prioritize protein and eat real food. You'll also hear Josh's take on popular supplements like red yeast rice, CoQ10, fish oil, and creatine, and what the evidence really says about when to use them. This episode is a goldmine for clinicians who want to stay evidence-based and patient-centered in the exam room. So get comfy and enjoy my conversation with Josh. Josh, I am so excited to have you back on the podcast. This has been a long time coming. We've had some behind-the-scenes tech nightmares, so I'm really, really excited to get this episode out to the world because you were on previously on episode 111, where we discussed lipids and understanding LDL and HDL and how to explain that to our patients, because a lot of us, me, are telling our patients that LDL is bad and HDL is good, and there's some more science to advance that recommendation. So if you guys didn't catch Josh in my previous episode with him, after today's episode, go listen to number 111. I will link to it down in the show notes. But today we're unpacking all things nutrition. And Josh, thank you so much for being here. I can't wait to pick your brain on this topic.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back. And we will not let technological conspiracies deny us from getting our message out.
No, the world needs to hear these things. And it is true because a lot of my audience is so eager to hear your thoughts on nutrition and cardiac diet and just what are we supposed to tell our patients? Because if you've been on social media, which unless you live under a rock, there's a lot of conflicting advice and sometimes even literature out there when it comes to the best diet for lowering lipids. So that's kind of where I want to start. I want to start big picture. And if our patient comes into the clinic and they say, hey, doc, what's the best diet? You told me my cholesterol is too high. Well, what am I supposed to eat?
To unpack this, I'm going to give 3 core tenets to help frame our further conversation. So the reality is there are multiple dietary strategies that can help both optimize your metabolic health and get you living in a safer lipid neighborhood. The standard American diet is just not one of those strategies. So that's the first one. Now, the second one is if there is a specific diet that you've decided is right for you to employ, you can probably find an article to justify what that is, unless it's the standard American diet. Conversely, if you have decided that whatever diet someone else has chosen, your friend or something, is not good, you can probably find an article to justify your position on that. The reality is the overall dietary pattern that you have chosen to employ and the consistent approach to that is more important than being super granular about how many grams of viscous fermentable fiber that you got or the hydrocarbon length of the individual fatty acids in your diet. And so my general approach is prioritize protein, eat real food. And people are like, oh man, I was expecting for you to, give me some specific, name of a diet. But it's like, well, that's the reality, You intuitively know that a handful of blueberries is superior to a handful of Skittles, even if those Skittles don't have red number 40, So we know those things, all right? That didn't make Skittles a health food. And number 3, If you are showing signs of insulin resistance, because one of my mantras is control your insulin, control your life, because a lack of insulin is incompatible with life. And we know that from diabetic ketoacidosis. And then we also know that hyperinsulinemia drives a lot of chronic disease in this country. So there's a sweet spot. Okay. So if you are showing signs of insulin resistance on your blood work, the first question I ask is, are you exercising? Because we know from elegant work done by Jerry Schulman at Yale that insulin resistance starts in skeletal muscle. And that can be quickly abrogated if you start exercising. Now, if you are exercising and you still are showing signs of insulin resistance, then I think we need to reevaluate what you're doing dietarily. And so those are my three things there. Prioritize protein, eat real food is really, my basic suggestion to people, but really meeting people where they're at is important and going through what they're doing and tweaking things from there. And of course, hopefully you're doing that on a background of sleeping and getting both a combination of resistance and aerobic exercise.
I really love that approach of just like keeping it simple and basic for patients, especially if they're just getting started out on this journey and not overcomplicating things for them. And you're right. A lot of different dietary patterns out there are proven in the literature to be beneficial and supportive for lowering lipids or for managing blood sugars. So, we've talked about the portfolio diet, DASH diet, Mediterranean style diets. Those all can be beneficial for patients. Now, two big ones that I want to unpack and pick your brain on, and they are sort of similar. One is a new kid on the block, the carnivore diet, and the older one, the ketogenic diet, has been around for quite a long time, but has become more popular in the weight loss field. And, both of these diets are a very heavy meat, high fat diet. Carnivore is animal based only. And so there are two very vast camps that people sit on when it comes to these diets. One is like, no, this one is awful. Don't do this. You need more fiber. You need more fruits and veggies. And the other one is like, I've never felt so good in my life. And so if a patient comes to us and is like, hey, I saw the carnivore diet, my neighbor's on it, he looks great, he's healthy. Like, what do you think? Should I follow that diet? So can you unpack those two and what the literature shows for us?
And so there's a lot to unpack with these sorts of low carb diets. And a lot of times people will use low carb diet and ketogenic diet interchangeably. Ketosis is a natural physiologic adaptation to low glucose availability. And so you will shut out ketone bodies when glucose availability is low. But there are people who are on high protein diets who aren't necessarily in ketosis. And honestly, unless you have refractory epilepsy and potentially some other neurodegenerative conditions, I don't think there's a huge advantage to continually being in ketosis. It is if you have epilepsy because it suppresses seizure activity. And there may be some further applications down the road as further research is done. Now, the ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet can be a really, really powerful tool for people who have diabetes or insulin resistance. A lot of times, some degree of carbohydrate restriction and even a ketogenic diet can work wonders as far as ameliorating their metabolic health and restoring insulin sensitivity. That's wonderful. There have been some people who have been able to have their autoimmune diseases like inflammatory bowel disease go into remission by using some sort of carnivore diet or a ketogenic diet. And that's wonderful. I mean, when people get their lives back and they're restoring their quality of life, you got to love that. Additionally, there have been people who have had bipolar disorder or who have had refractory depression and they have elected to endorse a ketogenic diet and that has given them their lives back. That's amazing, And when we're talking about your lipid neighborhood, because every ApoB containing particle, the vast majority of those being LDL particles, are potentially criminals that can infiltrate your arterial abode. You can check out episode 111 for the full framework there. We need to continually be evaluating that, whatever dietary approach that you have chosen to start. And so whenever somebody decides to go on a low carb ketogenic diet, there are often people who their lipids get better, actually. Their triglycerides decrease. If you measure particles, which particles dictate risk, they actually will decrease as well. And that's great. However, there are certain people when they elect to do a low carb ketogenic diet, they will have these really huge stratospheric spikes from their baseline when it comes to LDL cholesterol. Okay, that's interesting. It doesn't happen in everybody. It actually probably happens in a minority of people, but we see these things. And so the question is, okay, well, even though this person is probably controlling their insulin, controlling their life, and most of these people who have these spikes are not insulin resistant, which is good. It's good not to be insulin resistant, but is it acceptable? Is it safe? Is it fine for you to have an LDL cholesterol that is 254 milligrams per deciliter? And for context, anything over 190 is familial hypercholesterolemia. And so on average, a lot of these people have LDL cholesterol levels that look like they have a genetic disorder in cholesterol metabolism. And we know that a lot of people with familial hypercholesterolemia have premature and advanced atherosclerosis, although not everybody gets that. And we should study those people who somehow are living in this rough lipid neighborhood but don't get broken into. We learn a lot from the exceptions in physiology. But right now, we know these people have a baseline, and it's not stratospheric LDL cholesterol levels. And we know because hopefully we're rechecking at 4 to 12 weeks after you have adopted this new lifestyle, what's going on with your parameters of glucose metabolism and with your lipid neighborhood. Because we want to keep close tabs on things when you radically change your life. And hopefully we've gotten some baseline imaging too. Got plaque, get a CAC, right? So we know if you've been broken into or not. Well, let's say that we know your baseline and then it shoots up to these stratospheric levels. Well, I think we need to ask some questions. There are different ways to do keto. There's dirty keto, and then there's a cleaner keto. If for some reason you are eating sticks of butter to stay in ketosis, well, why are you doing that? That's weird. Maybe we should talk about that. Maybe we should substitute, some other sorts of fats rather than just, mainlining butter. And so there are different fatty acid compositions. There's unsaturated fats or saturated fats, and we can talk about those components as well. And then we can also talk about some of the other ways that they are achieving this low carb ketogenic diet to, try to maybe say, hey, let's try this and see if your levels come down. And then the real question too is, why does this even happen? Why do some people get benefit here as far as their lipid neighborhood and their home security system from a insulin sensitivity standpoint? And why do some people get these stratospheric bumps? That's actually a topic of ongoing investigation, and they're actually going to study this to see exactly, whether the people who muse about these things are on the right track or not. So I'm really excited about that, because for my second book, the remixed second edition for the clinician and anyone on a mission for more lipid tuition, because sometimes you're compelled to start rapping about metabolism and lipids. I just wrote the chapter on my speculations on what happens in this group of people who are called lean mass hyperresponders, or LMHRs, who have these stratospheric bumps in LDL cholesterol when they have adopted a ketogenic diet. It's really complicated. It's at the deep end of the community pool. You don't have to dive in if you're not comfortable there. But to simplify this, one of my speculations is it has to do with insulin. It always does. Control your insulin, control your life. Because in conditions of low insulin, you have a lot of lipolysis, which is the liberation of fatty acids from stored triglycerides. Conversely, when you're insulin resistant, you also have excessive lipolysis. But in this context, these people aren't insulin resistant. They just have chronically low insulin levels. And so the liver is flooded with these fatty acids, and the liver doesn't want to be drenched in fatty sterol gravy. So what it does is it churns out more of these ApoB-containing particles to try to not be soaked in all the fatty acids that are flooding back to the liver. Additionally, we've always been taught that most LDL or all LDL particles, I should say, are products of VLDL, IDL hydrolysis. And so they start out as a big, fluffy, triglyceride-laden VLDL particle. That mailman delivers the mail, becomes an IDL, unloads a little more mail, and becomes an LDL particle. That's typically what happens, but not always. And especially when you have lower plasma triglyceride levels and chronically low insulin levels, you tend to shuttle out more direct LDL particles. And so it wasn't a VLDL or an IDL first. So very, very interesting about directly secreted LDL particles is that those particles have an anti-lipolytic effect on adipose tissue. And so it kind of prevents those adipocytes from just flooding the liver with excess free fatty acids. And so that's one of my speculations on what's going on here. But basically, your body's trying to do some damage control, and it doesn't like all the fatty acids that are flooding back to the liver, but also it's a low insulin state, so you're not going to necessarily create more de novo lipogenesis from it. And so it's trying to do all sorts of things to cope with the new metabolic milieu in which it has been thrust. Okay, so all of that is like, all right, I never want to hear this guy talk again. I don't want to be friends anymore. I don't want to read his second book. Okay, that's fine. But really, the takeaway is this safe? Should we be comfortable with having these LDL cholesterol levels in, the range of somebody who has genetic familial hypercholesterolemia? Well, there was recently a study done. It was called Keto CTA. And what's tough about these studies is there wasn't a control group. And I'm sure there were a lot of people screened that didn't qualify for the study, but there were 100 of these people. And they baseline got CT angios, which is kind of like a CAC on steroids because it will show you soft plaque and some of the other high-risk plaque features. And they followed them for a year. and these people have LDL cholesterol levels of 254 on average. And they wanted to say, hey, do these people have plaque that progresses or do they not? Because that's kind of important. If you have plaque, do you want that plaque to be stable or unstable? Do you want it to progress or regress? Yeah, I'd probably prefer it to not to regress and hopefully confer some stability to it. And so what they looked at was non-calcified plaque volume. So this would be soft plaque. And that is thought to be more vulnerable. And at the end of 1 year, there was an increase in soft plaque, non-calcified plaque volume by 18.8 cubic millimeters. Now that doesn't probably do anything for anybody, but there's another study called Nature CT where people who didn't have these stratospheric levels, who weren't on any lipid lowering therapy, and there were even people with hypertension in there, so they wouldn't have a perfect home security system across the board. They progressed on average annually by 4.9 cubic millimeters. So that's quite a bit less. And so that isn't particularly encouraging to me at this point. Additionally, people who had baseline coronary artery calcium scores, so they'd been broken into of over 100, they progressed annually by a different marker called percent atheroma volume by 2.4%. Anything over 1% is a rapid progressor. And no matter what you're doing dietarily, I'm very concerned about that person. And I'm going to do everything I can to get that person living in a safer lipid neighborhood, because once you've been broken into, you're more likely to get broken into over and over and over again. And that can lead to cardiovascular events. And we don't want that. So at this point, do I feel comfortable when somebody has these excessive levels that bump up to stratospheric levels on a low carb ketogenic diet? No. And so if there is a reason to, continue to be in ketosis, like refractory epilepsy, okay, I'll meet you where you're at, but I'm going to, consider a conversation about lipid lowering therapies and things of that nature. But also if there's a way to blunt this, whether by rearranging kind of the fatty acids in your diet or by refeeding, mixing a sweet potato a couple times a week, and that'll work. One of the famous experiments done by one of the people who does this low carb ketogenic diet, has high levels, is he was able to reduce his LDL cholesterol levels dramatically just by eating Oreos. And that was more of a, sensationalistic way to do that. And I would say, well, hey, you don't have to eat Oreos to do that, even if they lack food dyes or whatever they're going to do these days. But, just mix in a few healthier carbohydrates a week and you're probably going to blunt these crazy excursions in LDL cholesterol. So my recommendation would, at this point, what we see, and there is more data coming out. We haven't seen all the data from this cohort, but at my recommendation at this point, I wouldn't be comfortable. But if I were doing this or somebody in my family or one of my patients did it, I would want to have conversations about, all right, we want to still, control your insulin, control your life. I still want you to have great insulin sensitivity. Of course I do. But let's talk about ways to not jeopardize your lipid neighborhood in the process. Sorry, that was a long answer to that, but there is a lot to unpack with this sort of thing. And this has been a subject of much hullabaloo in the lipid world lately. And this is my first chance to opine on it.
I love your excitement. It's a big topic. So thanks for tackling that. And I think the biggest takeaway that I got from you is if a patient is excited about it, wants to try it, I think it's important to, yes, provide education, support them on it, make sure it's going to still provide joy in eating. Cause I think we forget a lot about that when we're giving nutrition advice is like, are they just miserable eating meat? Or are they like really excited about the thought of a very high protein, low carb diet? Does that excite them? Because if they can follow it consistently and without much difficulty, then I think give it the green light. And I think a big important thing that you had said earlier on is close follow-up. We've got to be rechecking their labs to make sure that they're not just going on years and years without rechecking their lipids. So what was that time frame that you suggest if you do make a dietary or medication change? When should we be checking those labs?
Yeah. So the recommendation for whether you're starting a lipid lowering therapy medication or whether you are changing up a diet lifestyle, the recommendation is after you make a change, recheck in 4 to 12 weeks. And I think that's very, very reasonable. A lot of times, it's like, 6 weeks is somewhere in there. And then you can see how they're doing, see how they're feeling, see if they've been adherent to things. And honestly, with whatever dietary approach is employed, whether it be a Mediterranean diet or a low fat diet, which, I'm not in general a huge fan of, but it can work for people if they want to do that, or, just a high protein, low carb diet, whatever dietary strategy it is. If you have somebody who is able to give you accountability, that's huge. With all these interventions, they work better when you have people on board with whatever you're doing to kind of help you along in the process, and a whole team, whether it be dietitians, clinicians, and preferably everybody on board. And that helps you be adherent and compliant to whatever you're doing. And it helps them meet you where you're at too, to say, hey, how can we tweak this? Oh, you're not feeling so good with this, or this biomarker doesn't look good. Well, what can we do to maybe, have a few subtle tweaks to still get what we want out of it, to have you have a good quality of life, to have you have good metabolic health, but also to address whatever concern we're seeing on labs or with your quality of life.
Okay, all my dietitians listening are going to be like, heck yeah, he gave us a shout out, because dietitians are not utilized enough on the medical team. So thank you for mentioning that dietitians are so vital to the success of your patient. So if you're not working with a dietitian, refer your patient to one to help your patient and help you answer your patient properly. So all my dietitians are like, yes, Josh, we love you.
I need to make some friends after inevitably having certain people like mad that I'm not giving them, the actual answer to what is the best diet. Well, if it existed, I would tell you.
I know. Yeah.
It's fun to talk about all the stuff.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about fat, because this is a big topic, but a lot of the cardiac diets, right? If you worked in a hospital system, if patients had an MI or has elevated lipids, the diet order is cardiac diet. And that traditionally is low fat, low sodium, some lower cholesterol. I would love for you to unpack the importance of that, and if we should be focusing on educating patients on consuming lower saturated fat foods and focusing more on unsaturated fats, and sort of your take on that whole dietary fat approach.
Yeah. And so in general, I will acknowledge that low fat diets can work. There's a couple studies, the Heidelberg study, and there was another study, the Lifestyle Heart study. It was more of an Ornish diet. And those people did quite well. Now, they had also a bunch of lifestyle interventions too, and a lot of follow-up. And those people seem to do fairly well. However, I think that low fat itself, compliance is very difficult. And unless you have something called lipoprotein lipase deficiency, or a biallelic variant that results in complete lipoprotein lipase deficiency, and this is a real lipid nerd topic, but these people have chronic pancreatitis, and so they need to adhere to a very strict low-fat diet. Outside of people who have that, I don't think that, in general, this is the best approach. And ironically, two of the trials showing the Mediterranean diet reduced cardiovascular events, the Predimed trial and Cordioprev, the Mediterranean diet is not a low-fat diet by any stretch either. So I'm not, in general, a huge fan there. And what it comes down to is what you're replacing the fat with. And oftentimes people are replacing dietary fat or saturated fat with refined processed carbs. Does that work? Does that ever work? No, it does not. And when we're just talking, saturated fat, it does tend to raise LDL cholesterol a bit, but it also depends on what type of saturated fat is. And so the shorter the chain of saturated fat, the more effect it tends to have in increasing LDL cholesterol levels. And so, for instance, if you have lauric acid, and then that will raise LDL cholesterol a little more than myristic acid. And then palmitic acid will also raise LDL cholesterol. But once you reach stearic acid, which is an 18-carbon saturated fat, it seems to have a neutral effect on LDL cholesterol levels. And guess what? Stearic acid is in dark chocolate. And so I made friends with all the dietitians, and now I'm going to make friends with pretty much everybody else, because everyone's like, oh, you're right, dark chocolate. Now, the point is not to go out and, eat all the dark chocolate in the universe. But what it really am trying to say is it depends on the source of saturated fat when you're dealing with these things. And it comes back to dietary pattern. There's a big difference between eating pigs in a blanket versus, having feta cheese on your Mediterranean bowl. And intuitively, this is a better choice. Nobody, when they eat some fried abomination at the Golden Corral, is like, all right, this is it. I am crushing it today. And so you intuitively know that this is not the place to be getting these sorts of fats and, your saturated fats and refined carbs. So all the terrible things all in one. And so I think that that's the key. Whatever you have adopted as far as your nutritional approach, and if there are swaps, then you need to be mindful of what you're substituting it for. And one of my favorite studies is the OmniHeart trial. They actually swapped protein out for carbs, and that actually had the greatest benefit on LDL cholesterol and triglycerides, even more than swapping out unsaturated fat for saturated fats. And so once again, all these things are kind of coming back to, well, let's not be in a state of hypercaloric chronic overnutrition, because quite frankly, everything goes wrong in those states. And let's just be mindful of what we're eating as far as, oh, this is a quality food. We're eating salmon, we're eating, Greek yogurt, we're eating, real food, and we're prioritizing protein in the process. Yep. That seems to work pretty well. And so anyway, I think the context always dictates these things, and being mindful of what you're substituting. And just to wrap up this discussion, one of my favorite studies is the Cooper Clinic study, where they looked at people and their dietary patterns. And a lot of these studies are also limited by, it's a subjective food log. It's like, oh, what did you eat on these days? And so there are limitations to all these things. But they took people with the highest cardiorespiratory fitness. And so these people had 14 metabolic equivalents or higher on their treadmill test, which that'd be like a 7-minute mile, just for context. And they asked them, okay, what are you guys eating? And there were some people that, qualified for the healthy eating pattern. And there were some people that were like, oh yeah, they're not too bad, but it's not perfect. And there were some people that were just in the unhealthy eating pattern. And guess what? The risks of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease were almost equivalent in all of those groups at the cardiorespiratory fitness level that was the highest. So I still say don't eat crap, but at the end of the day, prioritize performance too. And then hopefully you're going to be fueling the machine with quality food. But really, the context matters. Just try to go crush it at life. Be fit. Nobody ever said, I wish I was weaker. Nobody ever said, I wish I had a, lower cardiorespiratory fitness. So go, lift some weights, run around, crush it at life. And if you're going to do good at those things, you probably want to be fueling the machine with quality food at the same time. So anyway, there you go. The only thing that people probably like from that whole diatribe was, hey, dark chocolate. I like dark chocolate, so we can still be friends.
No, I disagree. If my dad were listening, he would be like, see, he told me to eat more protein. But I think this is where education is very important, because I believe that a lot of us have patients like my dad. He's 65. He's got metabolic disease. He's got AFib, got obesity, like a lot of our older male patients, and a horrible diet. And when I say, Dad, you need to eat more protein, he thinks beef jerky, fried chicken sandwiches, these types of, I would consider them higher fat, higher sodium foods. So when you say prioritize protein, how can we be sure that our patients are on the same page with what types of protein we're recommending?
Yeah. And to your point, people love to hear good news about their bad habits. It's like, oh, Mediterranean diet. Well, let's go eat pizza and pasta all day. And so you can find a way, to eat unhealthy, whatever dietary pattern it ends up being. However, if you're frying anything, no, that's not it. Intuitively, I don't think people are like, all right, this is it. Fried chicken. This is the choice. Well, why don't you just grill it? And so just easy, swaps like that. Additionally, things like salmon has a combination of unsaturated and saturated fats and whatnot. And it's just, one of the best foods on God's planet, and it has also, a combination of omega-3 and some omega-6. Anyway, it has all sorts of good stuff. And so Greek yogurt, I'm a big fan of Greek yogurt. I think I keep Chobani in business just because I eat so much Greek yogurt, and then cottage cheese, things like that, fermented dairy. And so those sorts of things are typically what I gravitate towards, lean cuts of steak and whatnot. And if you're having a steak a couple times a week, in the context of, an overall dietary pattern that's prioritizing protein, eat real food, is that terrible? No. And so there are multiple approaches that can work, but if you're frying anything, I would question why you're doing that. And, I think that there are many real foods that actually, if you kind of get in the groove, they taste pretty good, then you can get used to doing things that are probably better for your life than going to the Golden Corral every day.
Yes, very true. Okay, there's still so many things I want to talk about with nutrition, but I wanted to move on to talk a little bit about supplements. Now, a prior conversation that we had, you actually did a live Zoom call for a few of members in my audience and part of a PA group on Facebook. And so if you guys want that recording, I'm happy to share it with you. Just shoot me an email, Colleen@examroomnutrition.com. And I'm happy to just send you that recording. It was really, really great. He answered a lot of high-level questions, but we didn't get to everything. So I wanted to find out your thoughts on some supplements. So what is your opinion on CoQ10, fish oil, and red yeast rice?
Okay. So I'll start with red yeast rice because it's probably the most cut and dried. Red yeast rice is just lovastatin. And lovastatin was actually the first statin that ever came to market in 1987. It's not a very good statin. Actually, it's not as potent, it has a lot more side effects, but what you're getting with red yeast rice is the mystery meat version of lovastatin. So how much lovastatin are you getting in there? Don't know. Are you getting any? Also don't know. Is it even a good statin if you are getting anything? Not that good compared to what we have out there now. So I would just not do it. It's not very good. It's nice to know what you're getting. And if you have any reason to employ any sort of lipid lowering therapy, there are better ways to be certain of what we're doing rather than messing around, unregulated compounded thing that we're dealing with lovastatin. So don't do red yeast rice. No good. CoQ10. Now, CoQ10 is reduced by statins, and oftentimes people have statin associated myopathic symptoms. So their muscles hurt, and that's a real effect, and that happens. But a lot of times people think, oh, if I take CoQ10, then that will address my muscle symptoms. I don't actually think CoQ10 depletion is the reason why people have those muscle symptoms, even though plasma levels of CoQ10 do decrease with statins, with what's going on in individual tissues. It's unclear. And the studies of supplementing CoQ10 don't seem to really help in actually abrogating those symptoms. If you're going to do something for statin-associated muscle symptoms, I think the most promising thing is creatine, actually. There are a couple small studies recently where people started low-dose creatine supplementation for statin-associated myopathic symptoms, and it reduced their symptoms by over 50% from baseline. And creatine is good for a litany of reasons. And why this makes sense mechanistically, because I always think it's good to do things that make mechanistic sense from a biochemical standpoint, is statins actually reduce something called guanidino acetate methyltransferase, which is the committed enzymatic step in creatine synthesis. So do statins decrease creatine synthesis? Well, yeah. Is creatine useful for a whole host of reasons, including, efficiency in the musculoskeletal system? Yes. So let's just add some back. And so I think it makes sense why that would work. I'd love to see more work in larger scale studies, but I think it's pretty low hanging fruit. It has a lot of benefit for a lot of reasons, including, some emerging research in neurodegenerative disease too. So I think that creatine is great. And so why not? And then as far as fish oil, there's high dose EPA. So basically when we're talking fish oil, usually we're thinking DHA and EPA. And these are our omega-3 fatty acids. EPA, so high dose just EPA, it's called icosapent ethyl, is actually indicated for reducing cardiovascular events in people who have high risk of having cardiovascular events and triglycerides of 135 or greater. So some residual elevation in triglycerides, or people who have had cardiovascular events and still have those residual triglyceride elevations. And so there's actually prescription grade fish oil EPA, but it's EPA only for that sort of person. And that's something to talk to your healthcare provider about if you fit the bill there. As far as just fish oil supplements in general, most of the time, they're a combination of DHA and EPA. And DHA is interesting, and it's actually the primary omega-3 in the brain. And there are some studies that show that getting ahead of the game when it comes to Alzheimer's disease, particularly if you have an ApoE4 copy and you are inefficient at transporting DHA into the brain, you might benefit from increased supplementation there, particularly if your omega-3 index is low. And what's nice about an omega-3 index is you can actually check it. And so you want to be above 8%. If you're below 4%, then that increases, cardiovascular risk. And then, the data is still emerging on specific risk for neurodegeneration, but you want to be over 8% ideally. And I'm a big fan of trying to get that from food first. If you're not eating, some fatty fish, I think, that's in general a pretty good place to start. But, if you're still below that 8% threshold, then I think it's reasonable to at least consider supplementation with a good form of it, because all of these, supplements too, they have different kinds and different amounts. And you have to really look carefully at how much you're getting, because it's like, oh, look at this. It's a fish oil gummy. Yeah, it's got more sugar than it has DHA. It might taste good, but that's probably not the answer to whatever you're trying to achieve. And so the context matters. And I think that there's some utility there. But as always, I try to get whatever I'm getting from food first. And if you're able to do that with a balanced dietary approach, I think that's preferable. So anyway, something to think about there.
Well, you made more dietitian friends because we all support the food first approach. And so by you saying that, you suggest that patients get their omega-3s, omega-6s from food. All the dietitians, again, are cheering like a round of applause for you because they love that.
People are going to think that we actually talked about this before and that I just was plugging this the whole time.
I know.
But honest. That's just saying things off the cuff.
No, I love that about you. You amaze me every time you come onto the podcast with just how much you know biochemistry and mechanistic understanding of the human body. It really is just amazing. So thank you so much for coming on and just helping us unpack nutrition and some supplements. I'm sure we're going to have some follow-up questions, and I'm sure you will be on for round number 3 on the podcast. So if you guys have specific nutrition questions you want Josh to answer, send me a DM on Instagram at Exam Room Nutrition. I'll be happy to add it to the list and have him come back on again. But Josh, we've talked a little bit about your book. I would love for you to tell us about that and where listeners can purchase it.
Yeah, so my book is called The Home Security System and the Lipid Neighborhood, and that's on Amazon. And you can just search that. And my goal with that book is for you to laugh a little, learn a little, and then come away with a relatable framework for not having cardiovascular events. And what I say is, hey, if you don't like me as a person or you can't stand listening to me talk, then don't get the book because it's written very conversationally. It's not a textbook. I enjoy reading textbooks, but I'm weird. And so, I've tried to basically disseminate these things in a way that's fun and relatable and that you'll actually enjoy rather than just letting it collect dust on your bookshelf.
Well, I appreciate the tone and the voice that you teach with, because I went into pediatrics specifically because I hated cardiology and I hated nephrology. So I have avoided lipids my entire 9-year career of being a PA, but I have really enjoyed learning from you and everything that you've unpacked for us. So I recommend everybody go purchase his book. It's so fantastic. If you want to learn more about lipids, even if you don't work in cardiology or primary care, even for myself, my dad's a cardiac patient and he is my number one patient and I want him to be around for a long time. So I've just learned so much from you, Josh. Thank you so much for the gift that you are to the medical community. And I just appreciate you being here and I'm sure we will have you back.
Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks so much for carving out some time to learn more about nutrition today. If you loved hearing from Josh, you're in luck. He's coming back for a live Zoom Q&A on June 25th. Now, even if you can't make it live, don't worry, it will be recorded. His last workshop last month was a huge hit, and this is your chance to get your burning lipid questions answered. So grab your spot using the link in the show notes. Well, as always, let's continue to make our patients healthier, one exam room at a time. I'll see you next time.